This will put us halfway through the book of Daniel, but not halfway through our classes, because I've added an extra 13th class at the end of our study to look back over the book of Daniel with a bird's eye view of the whole process. And then, because of some comments that Nick has actually made in class, y'all remember Nick has brought up Esther, because Esther took place during the time of the Persian Empire, which is at the tail end of Daniel. I'd already planned on doing some studies in the intertestamental period, but I'm going to shrink it because I want to start the next class, which is going to be the cost of uncomfortable Christianity, the 1st of December. So I'm going to squeeze in 5 lessons that will cover the rest of the Old Testament history from Daniel till the coming of John the Baptizer. So we'll have 1 lesson on Ezra, 1 on Nehemiah, 1 on Esther, and then 1 on the Greek Empire and 1 on the Roman Empire, and see how that history helped pave the way for the coming of Jesus. Because it's all about the coming of Jesus, right? Everything is about the coming of Jesus. Galatians 4 and verse 4. In the fullness of time, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who are under the law. And so we're going to look at how Jesus was prepared for by those nations that were coming. Romania was a communist country for about 50 years, 40 years or so. Russia was communist about 70 years. Under communism, you could go to church if you had time. They kept you pretty busy. A lot of people had to work 7 days a week. I mean, even 6 days a week. You know, if you have to work 6 days a week, there's stuff you have to do on Sunday. Hopefully you squeeze out enough time to worship God on Sunday. But if you work 6 days a week, it really squeezes your calendar. So that was the mentality of the communists. So for the most part, you could say, this is just a blanket statement, but for the most part, the people that went to church were the old people. Either they were retired or in a health situation where they could still go to church on Sunday. That was the way communists kept Christianity at a minimum. They were okay with you going to worship, you know, in that sense. You could go to church, you could do all that kind of stuff, but just don't bring your Christianity outside of the church building. That's a communist mentality. Don't take it into the voting booth. Of course, under communism, there's no such thing as voting, right? But Christians were faithful. Now, some of them weren't. The communists would want preachers. I don't know if they did this to everyone, because that's a tremendous amount of paperwork, but communists would want to look at preachers' sermons to see what they were preaching on. They would keep up with what you were doing. They would want to read your literature to make sure you weren't criticizing the government. And when you have that kind of big brother looking over your shoulder, it's intimidating. But there were Christians that still stayed faithful, did what they could. Y'all have probably heard of the name Otis Gatewood. He was smuggling Bibles behind the Iron Curtain for years. He established the Eastern European missions in order to smuggle Bibles behind the Iron Curtain. He had a personal interview with Mikhail Gorbachev, and I met Otis Gatewood on the sidewalk in Vienna, Austria in 1992, right after he had visited with Gorbachev. And he told Gorbachev, I was smuggling Bibles behind your back into your country. He tried to convince Gorbachev to obey the gospel, but Gorbachev said that he had been baptized, as a baby, and he didn't need to do anything else. I commend Gatewood for having that kind of spunk. Even the fact that he got an interview or a face-to-face meeting with the president of Russia was impressive. Anyway, I said all that to lay the foundation for the study of Daniel here in Daniel chapter 6. And we've seen this since Daniel chapter 1, right? You're living in a nation that does not respect your religious convictions. How do you draw the line? How do you walk the line? How do you balance being faithful to your country, to your civic leaders, but at the same time being faithful to God? Now, this chapter is a climax of the narrative part of Daniel. Chapters 1 through 6 are narrative. In other words, it's a storyline going on. Beginning with chapter 7 is going to be visions through the rest of the book. So chapter 6 is kind of a dividing line. Daniel is towards the end of his life. Okay? You don't get that just by reading Daniel. You've got to pay attention to who's ruling When you go from Nebuchadnezzar to Cyrus and to Darius the Mede, you're jumping forward 70 years. So Daniel is in his 80s now. Okay, so I don't want to imply that you 80-year-olds are old, but he's old. He's in his 80s now. And things have changed. He's gone from being in Babylon, which jerked him out of his home, to being under the Persians now, and Cyrus is like, all right, go back home. Cyrus sent everybody home. Cyrus didn't care who you worshiped. He just wanted you to pray to your God for him. That was his mentality. So all you Jews, you go back home. You just pray to your Jehovah for me. So Daniel has seen a lot of change. And then Daniel's been challenged. We've seen that. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego have been challenged. So the names have changed, the ones who have been in power. The demand for compromise is the same. And the demand for compromise, of course, is still the same today. No difference. We've still got leaders who don't respect Christianity. They give lip service to Christianity, but they don't respect Christian convictions. So Babylon has fallen. That was last week. I appreciate Cody teaching the class last week. Babylon failed. The Medes and the Persians now control the empire, just like Daniel saw in chapter 2. This is God moving those pieces on the chessboard, okay? The pawn that is Babylon is gone. Now he's moving the pawn that is the combination of the Medes and the Persians, Medo-Persian Empire. And so Daniel has served under these leaders. And we don't get this just by reading Daniel. But Daniel has served under Nebuchadnezzar, Evil-Merodach, Neriglissar, Labash-Marduk, Nabonidus, Belshazzar. Those are all Babylonians. And now he's served under Darius the Mede, Medo-Persian. Ike Hoover was the longest serving chief butler in the White House. 42 years. He served under 10 different presidents. There's one other butler that served under 11 presidents, but he didn't serve as long as Ike Hoover. I think it'd be pretty cool to serve in the White House if the presidents respected butlers. I wouldn't want to serve under a president that didn't respect butlers. So, Darius the Mede, we have him mentioned. This is the chief attack that skeptics make against the book of Daniel, because outside of the book of Daniel, we don't know who Darius the Mede is. There are other men named Darius, but they served Persia after this time frame. We don't have an answer for that. There are some suggestions that Darius was some kind of name for Governor Gubaru, whom the Persian king put over Judea, or over Babylon, the area of Babylon rather. Maybe Darius is a name for Cyrus. Cyrus is the Persian king who took down Babylon. So maybe it's popes take the name of a different pope when they become pope. Maybe something like that's going on. Maybe it's a name for some other governor. The fact is we don't know. But I'm confident at some point God will allow us to find out, and whatever we find out is going to be consistent with what Daniel says. Because last week, Belshazzar made Daniel third in the kingdom, and for a long time, skeptics were like, that's not right, because you've got Nebuchadnezzar, and then you've got Daniel, that's only two in the kingdom. Why is he the third? Well, the skeptics had to eat crow, because eventually we found out that Belshazzar served along with his dad, which put Daniel third in the kingdom. So Daniel turned out to be right. And I suspect this will happen too when we do more research. So again, Persia is tolerant of different nations, so they're letting them go home. And in chapter 9, Daniel is going to pray, God, let us go home now. The empires have changed, but the pride in the man sitting in office does not change. And we see that here with Darius in Daniel chapter 6. And that's an important lesson also when you get over and start reading the book of Revelation, because we've got the Roman emperors who also are prideful and calling themselves Lord and God, Dominus et Deus in Latin, and requiring people to worship them, treat them as gods. And so Christians in the first century are having to deal with that same problem, same challenge, because humans don't change. the earlier chapters were asking, can God's people survive a pagan education? That was chapter 1. Daniel did. Can God's people survive political promotion? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did because of their faith and their convictions in God. Can God's people survive persecution? They can, if they stay faithful to God. So Daniel 6 asks the question, can God's people stay faithful even when a government requires obedience and idolatry? Y'all all know Daniel chapter 6. Daniel answers the question, yes. Let's read the first 5 verses. It seemed good to Darius, Persian, to appoint 120 satraps over the kingdom, that they would be in charge of the whole kingdom, and over them 3 commissioners, of whom Daniel was one, that these satraps might be accountable to them, and that the king might not suffer loss. So let me just pause real quickly and point out, Daniel has been promoted now. Daniel's in his 80s, and he has been faithful to God first, but he's also been faithful to his civic rulers, which has allowed him to be promoted. So we can pledge allegiance to the flag and still pledge allegiance to Jesus Christ at the same time. Verse 3, then this Daniel began distinguishing himself. Why did he distinguish himself? Because the Lord blessed him. He distinguished himself among the commissioners and satraps because he possessed an extraordinary spirit, and the king planned to appoint him over the entire kingdom. We need a Christian, a member of the Lord's church, to be president of the United States. That's what we need. We don't need fewer Christians in politics. We need more Christians in politics. Just like we need more Christians in every sphere. Verse 4, then the commissioners and satraps began trying to find a ground of accusation against Daniel in regard to government affairs, but they could find no ground of accusation or evidence against corruption, inasmuch as he was faithful, and to no negligence or corruption was to be found in him. So he was living a holy, righteous life, consistent with the law of Moses, in a foreign land. Verse 5, then these men said, we will not find any ground of accusation against this Daniel unless we find it against him, underline this expression, with regard to the law of his God. So Daniel gets promoted because he's been distinguishing himself. His enemies can't find anything wrong with his work. Every T is crossed, every I is dotted. He is a conscientious worker in his secular life. He's the kind of employee that you all are, or were if you're retired now. A Christian serving Christ in the workforce. That was Daniel. And so his enemies are envious that he's been promoted over him because he's an outsider, right? He's not Persian, he's Hebrew. But they can't criticize him for anything except in regard to his religion. And that's remarkable because Daniel has lived under this environment for decades. If he was stolen out of his homeland, in his late teens, he's been living there for 70 years, 7 decades. And he's been walking that line, staying faithful to God first, but serving his government second. Y'all have heard the name David Lipscomb. Brother David Lipscomb did not believe that a Christian could serve in the government. He did not believe a Christian could be a teacher in the public school system. He believed that, it's almost Jehovah's Witness doctrine. He believed that there was such a vast gap between the kingdom of Christ and the kingdom of men that you could not bridge that gap. Didn't even believe you should vote because all non-Christians are under the influence of the devil. That was David Lipscomb. He wrote a book called The Civil Government. Daniel had lived decades in this environment, but the only predictable thing about him was his obedience to Jehovah God. His obedience to God. He had an excellent spirit in him, the text says. That's not necessarily the Holy Spirit's referring to. It's talking about his character, his wisdom, his ability. He could, don't you know that he was able to interact with different people? He could interact with his fellow Jews, and he could interact with the king of Babylon, king of Persia. Think about all those kings that he served under, all those leaders that he served under. Daniel's prayer life reflects the law of Moses, and we see his loyalty to Jehovah God outweighs his loyalty to the kings that he served under. Jeremiah talked about these exiles, and he told them, you may remember Jeremiah chapter 29, he said, you seek the welfare of that city. Seek the welfare of that city. It's fine and good for us to seek the welfare of the United States of America in whatever way that seeking welfare includes, as long as it doesn't put the country above God. Daniel did that. That's what Jeremiah said to do. So Daniel served Babylon without becoming Babylonian or Persian. Ezekiel also condemned corrupt shepherds and dishonest rulers, and we see in Daniel the exact opposite of that. Daniel's a righteous man. He's a righteous administrator living in a land that does not respect his religious laws. But faithfulness allows us to do that. Let me ask you this question. Why do honest people often become threats to dishonest systems? Your righteousness puts a shame to their unrighteousness, right? You can't work that good because it makes us look bad. Don't you know Daniel did that? Your honesty makes our dishonesty look bad. Integrity can be evangelistic. Light on the darkness, yeah. Jesus said in John chapter 3, people don't come to the light because they don't want their deeds to be exposed. This young lady whom Rachel taught when we lived in Romania and we baptized her, Felicia, at one point she said to Rachel, talking about the whole mission team, she said, you all are different. Real. She said, you all are real. Well, that wasn't because we were Americans. It's because we're Christians. Integrity can be evangelistic. The people should know that Christians cannot be bought. If it's the right thing to do, it's the right thing to do, and I'm going to do the right thing. And it doesn't matter what happens to me, because God needs to be glorified. I just got finished translating Deuteronomy chapter 32, and in Deuteronomy chapter 32, it's a song that Moses was to teach the nation of Israel to encourage them to stay faithful to God. And over again, God reminds Moses that he sinned against him. 5 times in the book of Deuteronomy, God told Moses, you ain't going in the promised land. 5 times. You and I would get sick and tired of hearing that, right? But the very last time here, not the last time, but in Deuteronomy chapter 32, God says, Moses, you were unfaithful. In fact, the text says you broke trust. God trusts us to respect His word. And when we break that word, we break God's trust. That's what He told Moses. Let's look at the next major paragraph here, verses 6 through 9. These commissioners and satraps came by agreement to the king, spoke to him as follows. King Darius lived forever. All the commissioners of the kingdom, prefects, satraps, high officials, governors have consulted together. So notice they're trying to put pressure on King Darius to, you've got to side with the majority. We've consulted together that the king should establish a statute and enforce an injunction that anyone who makes a petition to any god or man besides you, O king, for 30 days shall be cast into the lion's den. O king, establish the injunction, sign the document so that it may not be changed according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which may not be revoked. And therefore King Darius signed the document, that is the injunction. Makes me wonder if he even knew Daniel's behavior. Did he realize when he signed this law that he was condemning his friend to death? Text doesn't answer that question. But these officials persuade through flattery Darius to do what they want him to do, make it illegal to pray to any other god besides the gods of the Persians. They knew Daniel's behavior. He apparently did not, or he wasn't thinking. Politicians tend not to do that. But this is more than politics. This is state-sponsored idolatry. You've got to pray to our gods. But God is the only one who deserves prayer. The law of the Medes and the Persians. Yes. You got to raise your hand high like this.
It actually is saying, except to you, O king, you're the one that they're to pray to.
Pray to Darius, right.
Right. Not any other God. So I think the fact that
I think it would be Darius and the god of the Persians. But yeah, Darius as a divine being. Yeah, you're right. So the law of the Medes and the Persians, it was just an irrevocable law. It was the policy in that nation that once the king seals that document, it cannot be undone. In Esther, you remember that King Ahasuerus signed the law that allowed the Persians to kill the Jews. Well, when he realized that he was manipulated by Haman, he can't undo the law. So what does he do? He writes another law saying the Jews can defend themselves. There you go. So, the irrevocable law, the Medes and the Persians, the law cannot be changed. Now, of course, we've got this violating, for Daniel, is violating the law of Moses. You shall not have any other gods nor worship them. And again, we see reflected here the message of the book of Revelation where the Roman emperors were requiring worship. And the Christians in the first century are being tested to see if they're going to have the same kind of faith that Daniel had. We get tested. Not in the exact same way, but doesn't our allegiance get tested? So why do governments repeatedly seek ultimate loyalty from its citizens? Control. That just answers it right there. Control. Get everybody boxed together, one spot, thinking the same thing, and you've got to think the same thing I do. I am so thankful that we live in a constitutional republic where we've got 50 laboratories of democracy out there. And let those 50 do things the way they want to do them, and then we'll see which one works. So, Daniel is being challenged. How do I honor the government without worshiping the government? As Rachel pointed out, you got to pray to Darius. Well, how can I honor Darius without worshiping Darius? We saw back in chapter 2 when King Nebuchadnezzar put a price on all the wise men's heads if they couldn't interpret his dream. What was the first thing Daniel did? Called his friends together for a prayer meeting. Now Daniel does the same thing. Doesn't call a group together, but look at what he says, verse 10. When Daniel, now, and underline this, now when Daniel knew that the document was signed, he knew that he was signing his death warrant. He entered his house, now in the roof chamber. He had windows open towards Jerusalem, and he continued kneeling on his knees 3 times a day, praying and giving thanks before his God, as he had been doing previously. I'm not going to change a thing, Daniel says. These men came by agreement, found Daniel making petitions. They approached the king, verse 12. Did you not sign this injunction? The king replied, a statement is true. It may not be revoked. Verse 13, they answered and spoke, Daniel is the one of the exiles from Judah. He pays no attention to you, O king, or to the injunction which you signed, but keeps making his petition 3 times a day. As soon as the king heard this statement, he was deeply distressed. He loved Daniel, which makes me wonder, what, did you not think, you knucklehead, that one of your favorite advisors prayed to Jehovah God? So he was deeply distressed and set his mind on delivering Daniel. You see, Darius loved Daniel. Set his mind on delivering Daniel, and even until sunset, he kept exerting himself to rescue him. How am I going to get myself out of this pickle, he says. And these men came by agreement and says, recognize, O king, this is the law of the Medes and the Persians. No injunction or statute can be changed. So, verse 16, the king gave orders. Daniel was brought in, cast into the lion's den. King spoke and said to Daniel, your God, whom you constantly serve, will himself deliver you. Isn't that a great statement of faith? That's the same statement of faith that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego gave in Daniel chapter 3, verses 16 and 17. And he's not even a Jew. Your God will deliver you. Have y'all ever been encouraged in your faith by somebody who's not a Christian? It happens sometimes, doesn't it? We have half a dozen people in Romania who bent over backwards to help us, and they never were interested in studying the Bible. But they sure helped us without expecting anything in return. Rachel referred to them as our angels. Verse 17, a stone was brought and laid over that mouth of the den, verse 17. And the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the signet rings of his nobles, so that nothing would be changed in regard to Daniel. The king went off to his palace and spent the night fasting, and no entertainment was brought before him, and his sleep fled from him. Daniel is in the lion's den playing rummy or something with the lions, and the king is up there losing sleep. The one who's in the lion's den is got peace of mind, and the one who's outside the lion's den is the one who's not got peace of mind. That's what happens when you walk with God. That's what happens when you trust God. Why was his window open towards Jerusalem? Because that was home. That's where the throne of God was, referring to the Ark of the Covenant. That was where the temple was. And that's where Daniel was hoping to go to. We have no record that Daniel ever made it back to Babylon, because the book of Daniel is not about Daniel. It's about God. But Daniel opened his window towards Jerusalem because he was praying for that temple and that return. 1 Kings chapter 8 is where Solomon builds the temple and he dedicates the temple. And the temple was the heart of Judaism, right? It was the heart. And that's why God had to destroy it, eventually in AD 70. The Israelites, their lives revolved around the temple. Their spiritual lives revolved around the temple. Of course, Jeremiah predicted 70 years, and then you'll come home. Daniel had his window open praying for that time to come. Maybe he was praying that he would live to see it. And he did live to see the exiles return. Again, we don't have record that he was part of those exiles. Maybe he was. But he did not protest what the king said. He didn't go out picketing. No political campaign, no secret meetings and so forth. He just goes about doing his worship like he's supposed to. I pray that we never get to that point in the United States where we have to worship, in secret. But our children or grandchildren need to be prepared to do it if it happens. Darius is deeply distressed, as we've read. He likes Daniel, but he can't save him, because this is a situation where man's power is limited. Why is ordinary consistency often more powerful than dramatic heroics? Why is daily Christian living more powerful than some kind of one-time display of spirituality? Yeah. Consistency reveals character. When you do the same thing day after day after day. Barna Research just released some research that shows that pastors in mega churches, like the Joel Osteens, are less trusted than preachers in small churches. What do you think about that? Because preachers in small churches have a relationship better with... Can you have a relationship with 10,000 people? Small churches, you've got a relationship. I think preachers are the third on the list of people that people trust. Because it's consistency. Most faithfulness is simply refusing to quit ordinary obedience. God is not expecting us to do something extraordinary. God isn't expecting us to do something extraordinary. He's wanting us to wait for the coming of the Son, and while we wait, we stay faithful. That's what God's expecting. Live in peace with all men. Yep, that's a part of living faithful. Okay, so the lion's den, we read verse 18. Beginning in verse 19, the king arose at dawn at the break of day because he's anxious about what's happened to his friend Daniel. And he goes in haste to the lion's den. And when he came near the den to Daniel, he cried out with a troubled voice. You see, Darius is the one who's suffering. Daniel's not suffering. He cried out with a troubled voice. The king spoke, said to Daniel, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God... Notice that he identifies Jehovah God as the living God, which normally contrasts Jehovah with the non-living gods, the ones that are made out of gold and silver and stone and wood. I don't know if that contrast is in Darius's mind, but maybe. Has your God, still verse 20, has your God whom you constantly serve been able to deliver you from the lions? That's what Darius expected. He's already said what he believed. And Daniel speaks up, verse 21, and he praises the king. He said, O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me, inasmuch as I was found innocent before him. And also towards you, O king, I have committed no crime. Then the king was very pleased and gave orders for Daniel to be taken up out of the den. Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no injury whatever was found on him because he had trusted in his God. No injury was found in him. Why? Because he trusted God. Notice there's no emphasis on the angel. God hasn't told us what angels do. We know from Hebrews 1 and verse 14 that angels are ministers to serve those who are heirs of salvation, in other words, Christians. But God hasn't told us what angels do. Why? Because he doesn't want us to trust angels. Don't trust angels. Don't look to angels. It's my opinion. Don't have pictures of angels up in your house. We don't need angels. We don't need to think about angels. Let God handle that. Trust God. He'll take care of the angels. So verse 23, the king was very pleased and gave orders for Daniel to be taken up out of the den. Daniel was taken up out of the den. I already read that. Verse 24, the king then gave orders, and they brought those who had maliciously accused Daniel, and they cast them, their children, and their wives. Now, the law of Moses says you don't punish the son for the sins of the father, but that wasn't the law for the Persians. Cast the wives and the children into the lion's den, and they had not reached the bottom of the den before the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. What happened to the men who tied up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to send them into the fiery furnace? What happened to the men? They got burned up. What happened to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? They didn't even get smoke on their clothes. I mean, God has a way of bringing darkness in the land of Egypt right up to the point where the Israelites live. Darkness on Egypt's side, light in the land of Goshen. God has that power. And God has the power to take care of those who are faithful to him. The king is fasting. The king has got sleepless nights. He runs to the den, and Daniel says, my God sent his angel. God took care of me. God doesn't abandon his servants. God never abandons his servants. So when we feel like God has abandoned us, we need to remind ourselves. Curtis Jones asked me to do a sermon on controlling our thinking, controlling our minds. And so I have developed that thought into 12 sermons. Guess what we're going to do next year? 12 sermons on submitting our minds to Christ. And a big part of that is we've got to talk ourselves into trusting God when Satan pulls us away. The Psalms do it all the time. Repeated imagery of God's people surrounded by beasts. Remember, the Apostle Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and 2 Timothy chapter 4, I believe, he talks about fighting with beasts, lions. Most scholars don't believe that Paul was in the gladiator ring, with the lions. Most scholars believe that Paul was using that as a figure of speech, fighting false teachers, Jewish teachers. Again, the book of Deuteronomy promises God's protection for faithfulness to his covenant over and over and over again. And Daniel illustrates that. And God hasn't changed. He's still faithful. He doesn't always stop us from suffering, but he walks us through that suffering. The Hebrew writer, Hebrews 11 and verse 33, refers to those who have stopped the mouths of lions. Who could that be but Daniel? Maybe there were Christians living in the first century that it referred to in some way, but it's got to at least refer to Daniel. So we finish the chapter, verse 25. Darius the king wrote to all the peoples, nations, and men of every language who were living in all the land. Now, doesn't this sound like Nebuchadnezzar from chapter 4? May your peace abound. I make a decree that in all the dominion of my kingdom men are to fear and tremble before the God of Daniel, Jehovah God. Now, he's not stopping them from worshiping all the other gods. He's not becoming a monotheist. But he at least is recognizing the power of Jehovah God. He is the living God. He endures forever. His kingdom is one which will not be destroyed, and his dominion will be forever, which reflects what Daniel said back in Daniel chapter 2, verses 44 and 45. Notice verse 27. He delivers and rescues and performs signs and wonders in heaven and on earth, who has also delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. I just studied Daniel chapter 32 as I was going through my colon prep for a colonoscopy. So I was studying Daniel chapter 32, which is a song that God taught Moses to teach Israel. In Daniel 32, verse 39, God says that nobody can deliver my people from my hand. Somebody else said something like that too, you remember? Jesus said that in John chapter 10 and verse 29. Nobody can snatch his followers out of God's hand because God is greater than all. God said it first in Deuteronomy 32, verse 39. Write that in the margin of your Bible there. Marvin? Deuteronomy 32. You may have. I may have said. I'm still under anesthesia, so you have to forgive me. Deuteronomy 32:39 is where God says, nobody can deliver my children out of my hand. Write that beside Daniel 6, verse 27. He just did that to show me that he was paying attention. So look at this pattern that we have going on with Daniel versus Christ. The false accusation, the governmental weakness to do the right thing. I mean, Pilate said Jesus was innocent 3 times, but he did not have the backbone to do the right thing. Innocent servant delivered from apparent death, vindication. Not a direct prophecy, of course, but perhaps foreshadowing. The stone that was supposed to keep God's servant in. The angels who are sent from the throne of God. Verse 28, so this Daniel enjoyed success in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Just like under Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian nation. We've got a little bit of time. Question, why does God sometimes deliver his people from suffering, other times through suffering? And related to that question, Acts chapter 12. Why did God allow James to get killed, but not Peter? Why does God sometimes deliver his people from suffering and other times through suffering? So we can learn and grow. Trust God. Pam?
Well, he tells us he knows how much we can handle, and God knows when to do what he's going to do, because there are times when he knows that
Yep. God knows us, and God won't put more on us. God will not allow us to put more on us than what we can handle. Sometimes it's hard to believe that, isn't it? We had a friend years ago whose dairy farm was destroyed by a tornado. And he was going inside as the winds were picking up. His teenage son was out there. His teenage son was on his four-wheeler coming towards the house. And one moment, Charles looked out there and he saw his son on the four-wheeler. He turned to do something. He looked back, and there goes the four-wheeler. And he didn't see his son for just, I don't know, just a few seconds, maybe a minute or something like that. His son had gotten off the four-wheeler to open the gate, and he was blocked by a telephone pole or power pole or something. But for a split second, he thought his son was gone. And through that whole thing, he and his wife had to get out of the dairy business because that tornado wiped out everything. Not their house, but their farm. And he told me one time, he said, Paul, I don't think I can bear what God has put on me. And he was referring to that verse. At that point, it was not appropriate for me to say, God knows what's best. He wouldn't put on you more than what you can bear. You don't say that at that moment. I just said, we got to pray. We just got to pray. And 2 Sundays from now, we'll talk about the Holy Spirit interceding for us in prayer. First, Rachel.
Back to that question, God, He knows, like His thoughts are higher than our thoughts, and His plans and what He knows, it's just more than we can even comprehend. So I think that's why He allows some things to happen, and it may be to help other people to start seeing their faith and trust.
Yeah.
Maybe to help other people more. So it may be beneficial for us to go through suffering for somebody else's benefit.
Yeah, sometimes people who are elderly say, why is God allowing me to stay here? Well, maybe it's for the benefit of other people. Because all we are servants of God, right? It's not about us. Yes. First Corinthians chapter 10, verse 14. Maybe verse 13. 13. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes, I think you're exactly right. He wants us to go to Him, right? So I think He will let us get to the end of our rope to show us that we can't do it alone. See, right, right. He will deliver us as long as we stay faithful. You see, on one of those storms on the Sea of Galilee, John chapter 6, Jesus sent His apostles out across the sea while He went up on the mountain to pray. And that's when the storm hit. I suspect Jesus knew the storm was coming. I suspect Jesus knew the storm was coming, and He sent His apostles out at the right time for them to be in the middle of that lake, to hit that storm, and have nothing else to do except to cry out to Him. It's my opinion. And I think that reflects what you're saying. Yeah, I do think God allows that to happen. Did you get the rest of it? We ran out of time. Anybody else have anything to comment? Oh, now I've got to go through the rest of them, Nicholas. Everybody says thanks, Nicholas. John 10:29. It's John 10:27 through 30 is the whole context, but verse 29 is where he says that nobody can snatch the disciples out of the Father's hand. Anybody else have any other thoughts or comments? I kind of go through these slides so that they'll be on the video when people watch it at home. But this particular class has like 60 slides. Right. Suffering strengthens our spiritual muscles, right? When I'm exercising and lifting weights, I don't see the muscles getting bigger. From one day to the next, I don't see the muscles getting bigger. Not even from 1 week to the next necessarily. Maybe it takes a month. So when we go through this spiritual suffering and we're staying faithful to God, our spiritual muscles are getting stronger. We can't see it, but they are. I mean, I've thought a lot about our friends Darren and Julie who lost their 24-year-old daughter, just unexpectedly. And I've thought about our 2 daughters, and I think, do you ever stop crying? I can't imagine not crying when you lose your daughter like that or your child. They're going to get through it. It'll be a new normal, right? That's what happens when you lose somebody you love. You got a new life. Different. Any other thoughts? Okay, let's pray. Our God and Father in heaven, we are thankful for your love for us and for the time we could spend together tonight in studying your word and being encouraged and strengthened from Daniel's behavior. And we pray, Father, that you'll help us to stay faithful to you and keep us in your care and bring us back together again on the Lord's day. In his name we pray. Amen.